Okay, good morning, everyone. So we're on chapter 5, and we left it, chapter 4, some really sad news, didn't we? That Jim's mother passed away, and it was Joseph who told him quite bluntly. So we're in this situation now where Jim's just found out for the first time. He was expecting to go to the infirmary to see his mum, but he can't. So we don't know how he's going to react. Well, let's find out. Jim forced his fists deep in his pockets and turned his face away. There were boys all around him, shuffling out to the cold yard, and they blurred into smudges of grey. He screwed up his eyes against the terrible blinding white of the sky. He wouldn't cry here. His lungs were bursting as he thought he would never be able to gasp for air again. But he couldn't cry here. The only person he wanted to be with was Rosie. She would know what to do. She would tell Emily and Lizzie. But there was no chance of being with Rosie. So why could he not cry there? What's stopping him from crying in the yard with all these other people? I want to go home, he said. Joseph swung his head and spat. Home? He said. What do you mean, home? What's this if it ain't home? So Jim thought, this is my home now. This huge building with iron bars at the window and iron railings outside. His parents must be Mr. and Mrs. Sissons, as thin and waxy pale as candles. And as if they were his parents, then his brothers and sisters were the shambling skinny boys who slept and sobbed in the same room as him, and the scrawny girls, skinny, who seemed to have forgotten how to smile. Can't I see her all the same? Joseph shook his head. She was took into the dead house in the night and put on the pauper's cart before light, sonny. Speedy dispatch, paupers get. No money for bells, nor nothing like that, eh? Jim went dumbly from room to room, as he was told, from the sleeping boxes to the yard, the refectory, the yard, and back to his box. It was like a slow dance, and the steps were always the same, repeated day after day after day. Morning started with 6 o'clock bell. 6 o'clock. When all the boys had to wash under the pump. So the pump as in to pump the water. Joseph watched them swinging his head from side to side and bending his neck round like a hunched bird of prey. He kept flapping his arms across his bent chest to beat the cold away. Get yourselves washed quick, boys, he said, afore the weather bites me bones off. Across the yard from the pump was the asylum. Mad people were locked up there. They wailed and shrieked for hours on end. They stretched their hands out through the bars of the prison. Give us some bread, boy, they begged. Let me out, let me out. Don't take no notice of them. Oh, wrong voice. Don't take no notice of them, a woolly-headed boy whispered to him one day. They're mad, they're animals. Jim was shocked. He stared again at the men and women and children who were all squashed up together. Their cage was too small to hold them. Their wailings echoed around the yard all the time. Animals, animals, Jim said to himself, trying to drive their noises out of his head. He looked away from them, pretending they weren't there. No, they're not animals, Jim, Joseph told him. They're people, they are. People, Jim. My ma's in there. There was a shed at the other end of the yard. I'll just sort of go back to that. So, asylum, certainly in the olden days, were for people that thought were mad or like mentally ill. Asylum, another meaning for asylum is like you often hear of like, people wanting asylum or like asylum seekers from another country. So often they've fled their country because of like political unrest, problems going on in their country. And then it's up to the government to decide if they can let that person into the country. Okay, so There was a shed at the end of the yard. Boys gazed out at them through a small barred window. Their white faces were even more frightening than the wailings of the mad people. Joseph sidled over to Jim, sort of like walking sideways, sort of trying not to be noticed. So Joseph sidled over to Jim that first morning and swung his arm across the boy's shoulder, bringing his head round to mutter down to Jim's ear. Now them the boys what tried to run away. They catch them and beat them and stick them in there until they're good. Remember that? So they put them in the shed. The shed in the middle of the yard, not a nice place to be. After the cold wash in the yard, Jim had to help to clean it out with brooms twice as tall as he was. They had to sweep till the ground was bare and clean, even if 100 of leaves had fallen in the night and come drifting over the high walls. At breakfast, the boys queued up with their bowls in their hands for bread and tea. The bread was meant to last for every meal, but if Jim tried to save it, he soon had it stolen by one of the older boys. He learned to gulp his food down as quickly as they did. Boiled meat at dinner time, cheese at night, all swallowed rapidly and in silence. So it's saying there, even if perhaps they didn't feel hungry, if they had anything left over, they needed to shove it in and swallow it as quickly as possible, otherwise it would be stolen by those other boys who would be really hungry themselves. So it was like a survival, really. You're trying to survive in that place with hardly any food at all. Sometimes Mr. Sissons read to them while they were eating, always Bible stories, and his whistly voice would glide around the echoing room over the clatter of knives and forks. Jim never listened to him. All he wanted to do was to think about his mother and Emily and Lizzie. But every now and then Mr. Sissons stopped reading and lowered his book. He stared round at the room, his eyes like round glassy balls, and his fingers cracking together. Jim stopped eating, afraid that he had done something wrong. He sat with his spoon held somewhere between his mouth and his bowl until the boy next to him nudged him into action again. Mr. Sissons put down his book and jumped off his day. So that's sort of a platform. He came gliding down the aisles between the long tables with a thin black shadow. Jim could see him out of the corner of his eye. He daren't for the life of him look up. The master lunged out at one of the boys at random, pulling him away from his bench by the back of his collar and sending his bowl flying and the contents splattering across their faces and clothes of the other boys. "Misbehaving, were you?" he said, his voice as dry as a hissing swan's. "Eating like a pig? Get to the trough, animal!" And the boy crouched on his hands and knees in front of a pig's trough that was always there, and had to eat his food from that, without a fork or a spoon. Sometimes there were half a dozen people troughing, usually just for Mr. Sissons' amusement. "Please don't let it be me. Please don't let it be me," Jim said deep inside himself as Mr. Sissons glided past, and the air turned as cold as ice around him. Well, it didn't. Obviously, metaphorically speaking, it was almost like the air turned cold around him, but it didn't. Just, it makes it sound more powerful, doesn't it? Jim had no idea how long he had been at the workhouse, and when his first thought was trying to escape, at first it seemed like an impossible idea. As impossible as making the pump in the yard turn into a tree and blaze out with leaves and blossoms. He remembered the runaway boys who locked up in the shed in the yard for everyone to see. Even so, he had to try. So that's why the boys are in the yard, in the shed, locked up in the shed, very tiny shed. It's a reminder for all the other boys that if you try to escape, you will be put in that shed for a long time without food or water. And you didn't want that, so it's to kind of encourage you not to escape. Because if you were caught, you were in the shed. Where are we? Okay. One day, he promised himself he would go. He would watch out every moment, sharp as a bird, for a chance to fly. And when he did, he would never be caught. He was almost too afraid to allow himself to think about it, in case Mr. Sissons pounced inside his thoughts and strapped him to a chair and beat him as he beat other reckless boys. Doesn't sound like a nice character, this Mr. Sissons, beating boys up. It was only at night that he let himself imagine escaping, as if it was though he was opening up a box of secret treasure in the dark. Old Marion crept and wheezed her candle path around the room where the boys lay in their boxes pretending to be asleep, and Jim let his thoughts wander then. He would escape. He would run and run through the streets of London until he was long, long away from the workhouse. He would find a place that was safe, and he would call it home. So very bold thoughts there, wasn't there, by Jim? But imagine that. He was too scared to think about in the daytime about escaping in case Mr. Sissons could somehow read his mind. He couldn't, but Jim was so worried. He could only think about it at night time. But he actually knows if he does escape, then he could go into the shed. If he gets found, which a lot of children did, he would get shoved into the shed, wouldn't he? Which seemed like a horrible place. But on the other hand, if he did escape that horrible, hellish place, then he'd be free. But what if he was free? He wouldn't get any food, would he? But the food was rubbish. So perhaps it's a gamble worth taking. What do you think?